Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to continue talking about the American Revolution. So we're going to go ahead and get started. The Frontier War. Defying the proclamation of 1763, colonists had begun to settle west of the Appalachian Mountains in the early 1770s. The outbreak of war between the colonists and the British escalated the frequent skirmishes between settlers and American Indians, leading the settlers to claim more Indian lands. The Frontier War was especially destructive. Most American Indians sided with the British, who had promised to keep the colonists in the East. With British urging, American Indians increased attacks on colonial settlements in 1777. Meanwhile, white settlers increasingly attacked and killed neutral American Indians or disregarded truces, beginning a cycle of revenge that continued for years. So the Native Americans are going to side with the British, because the British are the ones who are saying that they're going to keep the colonists kind of contained, keep them isolated in a certain area. Now, the argument could be made that hasn't really been working out very well so far, but the Native Americans looked at it and they realized that, if the colonists win, well, there's nobody to keep them in check. There's nobody to keep them contained. They'll just go wherever they want. So it kind of made sense for the Native Americans to side with the British. So the British kind of used the Native Americans, encouraged them to attack settlements and colonist towns, to weaken the colonies. And that is what they did. Now, the colonists did a lot right back to them and disregarded truces that had been made and just started a cycle that is going to continue for years. The War in the West. In the Northwest, Colonel George Rogers Clark led the Patriot militia in the fight against the British. They took the settlements of Kaskaskia and Cahokia in the spring of 1778. By late summer, Clark's 175 soldiers and their French settler allies had captured all the British posts in the area that would become Indiana and Illinois. Now, these settlement names, Kaskaskia and Cahokia, obviously these are Native American names. The British and their American Indian allies responded a few months later, recapturing a fort at Vincennes, Indiana. Clark's men, all unpaid volunteers, quickly rallied, marching from their winter quarters on the shores of the Mississippi River. In late February 1779, they reached Vincennes and convinced many American Indians to abandon their British allies, allowing the Patriots to recover the fort. At war's end, the Patriot outposts allowed Americans to lay claim to the Ohio River Valley. So, now whenever we think about the West, in modern day, we think about places like California, Nevada, New Mexico, that sort of thing. But whenever they're talking about the war in the West here, we're talking about places that are Indiana and Illinois, because to the country at this point, that was the West. Now whenever we think about Indiana or Illinois, that area, that's not the West. That's just, a little bit past where we live. That's not the West. But back in this time, that was the West. The United States, as it's going to become known here shortly, was just right along the eastern seaboard. That was all the country really was. And so whenever they are thinking about the West, Indiana, Illinois, that is going to be the West for them. But so if you're a little confused about seeing the title of the war in the West and it's talking about Indiana, Illinois, you're like, well, that's not the West. Well, back in this time, it was the West. The War in the South. As the war continued, the British expected loyalist support in the South, especially among the farmers of North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. But the British wasted this support by continuing their misguided strategy. Instead of supporting loyalist militias, the British continued to wage a conventional war. So, the British haven't really adapted to the way that the colonists are fighting. They are used to traditional European strategies, and they haven't adapted yet. So this is a misguided strategy. Initial British victories. In the South, as in the North, The British won most of the battles and captured the leading seaports. In late 1778, they seized Savannah, Georgia. During the spring of 1780, they captured Charleston, South Carolina, along with 5,000 Patriot soldiers. That summer, the British crushed another Patriot army at Camden, South Carolina. So it's not going very good for the colonists here. Just as the British began their offensive in the south, Spanish forces under Bernardo de Galvez made key attacks on British forts in the Gulf Coast region. In 1780, they captured the British fort at Mobile, Alabama. The next year, they took Pensacola, the capital of British West Florida. These moves were intended to solidify Spanish power in North America, but they also diverted British troops from the offensive against the Patriots. So, the Spanish are going to start attacking British settlements in the south, because to the south of the United States, at this time, Spain still controls Florida. We haven't gotten to the point where it becomes part of America, but Spain is set up in Florida. So they're going to try to solidify their own position and also take down the British power a little bit. The Patriot cause gained support. Despite winning major battles, the British failed to control the southern countryside, where the revolution became a brutal civil war between Patriot and Loyalist militias. Both sides plundered and killed civilians. A German officer in the British service observed, "This country is the scene of the most cruel events. Neighbors are on opposite sides. Children are against their fathers." In October 1780 at Kings Mountain in South Carolina, the Patriots crushed a Loyalist militia and executed many of the prisoners. As the Loyalists lost men and territory, neutral civilians swung over to the Patriot side. They increasingly blamed the British troops for bringing chaos into their lives. A disgusted Loyalist explained to a British officer, "The lower sort of people, who were originally attached to the British government, have suffered so severely and been so frequently deceived that Great Britain has now 100 enemies where it had one before." Instead of destroying the Patriots, the British Army helped make more of them. So as this conflict continues to go on and bringing chaos into people's lives, it's turning more people who used to be loyal to the British side to the Patriot side. So people are they're getting sick of this. It's destroying everything they've ever known, and they are getting tired of this war. As the countryside became sympathetic to the Patriots, General Cornwallis became frustrated. The Continental Army in the South was small, but it was led by two superb new commanders, Nathaniel Greene and Daniel Morgan. In early 1781, the Continental Army inflicted heavy losses on the British at the battles of Cowpens in South Carolina and Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. Thwarted in his attempts to take the Carolinas, Cornwallis marched north into Virginia. He was leading his troops directly into a trap. So, General Cornwallis, who is the leader of the British military, is trying to take the Carolinas, but he's failing. He keeps being defeated here. So, he retreats north into Virginia, which is supposed to be territory that the British have under control. The war comes to a conclusion. Although it seemed unlikely at the start, the Patriots ultimately won the war. Four main factors contributed to their success. First, the British made tactical mistakes because they initially underestimated the Patriots. Second, the British misunderstood the political nature of the conflict. Third, the Patriots were highly motivated and benefited from Washington's shrewd leadership. Fourth, the Patriots received critical assistance from France. While Spain helped as well, France was a lot more vital to their success here. The surrender at Yorktown. During the late summer of 1781, Washington boldly and rapidly marched most of his troops south. He planned to trap Cornwallis's army at Yorktown, Virginia. For the plan to work, however, Washington needed a French fleet to arrive at the right moment to prevent the British Navy from evacuating their army by sea. Although Washington thought that a French fleet was on the way, he could not be certain when it would arrive. The French fleet appeared at just the right moment to block the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, trapping the British Navy. Given the lack of efficient long-distance communication, this coordination was an incredible stroke of luck for the Patriots. Trapped by land and by sea, Cornwallis surrendered his army of 8,000 at Yorktown on October 19, 1781. The French had made the critical difference. At Yorktown, their soldiers and sailors outnumbered Washington's Americans. So what happened here was General Cornwallis gathered all of his forces, and they were in Yorktown, Virginia. Now, Yorktown is a port city, meaning that even if Washington's soldiers show up in Yorktown, he knows he can still escape by sea. You know, they could all load up onto a ship and sail away to safety. But what Cornwallis doesn't realize is that while, yes, it is a seaport, and yes, you can just sail off into the ocean from Yorktown, where Yorktown is located is on the Chesapeake Bay. And if you're familiar with what that means, it means that while, yes, it is saltwater, it is a port into the ocean, but in order to get from that bay into the ocean, there's one place where there's this opening that ships can get in and out of. Everything else is kind of surrounded by land. So imagine that my hand here is land, and in the middle here is the water, and right here is Yorktown, right here. This is Yorktown. He knows that he can escape out into the ocean, but he doesn't realize that that port to get into the ocean is actually quite small. So the French Navy sails up and they block that off. He can't escape by ocean anymore. So whenever Washington's men show up and trap him in the city, Cornwallis has no way of escaping. He had been relying on that seaport to get out, but he didn't realize it went into a bay, and whenever the French Navy shut off they blockaded the bay exit into the ocean, Cornwallis had nowhere to go, and he and his men surrendered at Yorktown. And this brought about the end of the Revolutionary War. Because, as I said earlier, Cornwallis is the leader of the British military. So it would be, trapping Cornwallis would be the same as if the British had trapped George Washington. You know, he's the leader of the military. Once you take him out, that's it. Well, the same with Cornwallis. He surrendered his army of 8,000 at Yorktown on October 19th, 1781. So, okay, here's a map that kind of gives some idea of what the situation was here in Yorktown. So, as you can see in the middle here, this is Yorktown. And as you can see, it is a seaport. Now, this is a river up here. This is the York River. So, he knows that, or Cornwallis knows that if he needs to escape into the ocean, he can just go out onto the bay and sail over this way. Over here is where the ocean is. But he doesn't realize that this is a bay. He thinks he can go either way. He can't go up this way. There's no way to get to the ocean up that way. So he has to go this way. He has to go over this way. So whenever the French show up and block this off, the French army on the ground has Yorktown blockaded from the north. The American army has it blockaded from the south. Cornwallis has nowhere to go. He knows he's trapped. He knows he's outnumbered. And this is when he gives up. This leads to the Treaty of Paris. The loss of 8,000 soldiers was a crushing blow to the British war effort. After 7 years of fighting, the British public was fed up with the casualties and the heavy taxes to pay for the war. In early 1782, a new administration came to power, determined to make peace. An American delegation including Benjamin Franklin and John Adams negotiated a favorable treaty with the British. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris recognized American independence and granted generous boundaries to the United States. At the negotiating table, Franklin secured far more territory than the Patriots had won in the war. By making a separate peace with the British, The Americans strained their alliance with the French, who had expected to control the negotiations. France and Spain each negotiated their own treaties with Britain. So, at this time, the war is over. Cornwallis has surrendered, and the Americans and the American forces with the French and the Spanish have won the war. So, if we think back to before the war started, what caused all these hostilities? Well, it was these taxes, because the British were needing to make their money back from the French and Indian War. So, the British were already financially hurting before this war even started. And now they have to fight with the colonists. And this goes on for multiple years. So, the British people, what essentially caused them to give up was they were out of money. They did not want to pay for this war anymore. You know what? They were probably of the idea that let them go. Let the colonies go. We don't need them. They need us a lot more than we need them. So if we just let them do their own thing, they'll come crawling back to us. That was what a lot of the British thought. Lord Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington after the British defeat at Yorktown in October 1781, the final battle of the American Revolution. Now, as you can see here in this picture, this is Cornwallis, and in an act of surrender, he is handing his saber over to George Washington. The impact of the Revolution. By 18th century standards, the American Revolution was very radical. For the first time, overseas colonies of a European empire had escaped control of their mother country to create a republican union, something long dismissed as a dangerous fantasy. By defying the conventional wisdom of their time, the Patriots began an enormous experiment aimed at creating a more open and equal society. The Patriots promised liberty and opportunity, but some Americans won more than others. The greatest winners were Patriot men of at least modest prosperity. They secured political rights and the economic benefits of Western expansion. The losers were Loyalists and American Indians who had sided with the British. The consequences for British allies. The British tried to protect their Loyalist allies by setting conditions in the treaty, but state laws and mob violence prevented most Loyalists from returning to their homes after the war. About 90,000, including 20,000 former slaves, became refugees. About half of them resettled in Britain's northern colonies. Many slaves were re-enslaved in the British West Indies. In effect, the American Revolution spawned two new nations, the American Republic and the future Dominion of Canada. American Indians were also stunned when the British abandoned them in 1783. The Treaty of Paris ignored American Indians, leaving them vulnerable to expanding American settlements. In treaties at Fort Stanwix in 1784 and Hopewell in 1785, the Patriots forced American Indians to give up massive tracts of land as the price of peace. Settlers surged westward. More than 100,000 Americans lived in Tennessee and Kentucky by 1790. That's only a few years. The Revolution was a disaster for the American Indians. So until this point, the colonists had to obey the British rules. And these British rules were beneficial to the American Indians. They restricted where they would settle, set these terms and things like that. So losing that constraint on the colonists was a disaster for the American Indians. Women's public voices grow stronger. Women gained few political or legal rights as a result of the war, but they won respect based on the new conception of women as Republican mothers. Abigail Adams and Judith Sargent Murray noted that the Republic needed virtuous citizens who learned their virtue from their mothers. This invited women to speak out on issues that affected their ability to raise virtuous children. The Revolution inspired some women to seek a larger voice in public affairs. In a famous letter of 1776, Abigail Adams asked her husband John to remember the ladies in drafting the new nation's laws. Although John Adams respected his wife, he dismissed her request. I'm sorry ladies, history is not always kind to you. Changes for African Americans. Slavery seemed inconsistent with the ideals of the Revolution, but in 1776 1 of every 5 Americans was of African ancestry, and a majority of African Americans were enslaved. Most Americans, including some Patriot leaders, accepted slavery as natural. British and Loyalist critics mocked the Patriots as hypocrites, who spoke of liberty while holding slaves. In 1778, the Patriot governor of New Jersey confessed that slavery was utterly inconsistent with the principles of Christianity and humanity, and in Americans who have idolized liberty, peculiarly odious and disgraceful. The Revolution inspired many slaves to demand freedom. In the northern states, some slaves petitioned legislatures for emancipation and sued their owners in the courts. About 5,000 African Americans joined Patriot militias, the Continental Army or the Small Continental Navy, in return for a promise of freedom. However, the southern states feared armed blacks as a threat to the slave system, so at least 50,000 southern slaves escaped to join the British. Emancipation? The Revolution led to emancipation in the North, where slavery was not critical to the economy and slaves numbered only 5% of the population. While laws eventually banned slavery in the northern states, many northern masters sold their slaves to the South before they could become free. Emancipation failed in the South, where slaves amounted to about 1/3 of the population, and were essential to the plantation economy. In Maryland and Virginia, some planters voluntarily freed their slaves, a practice known as manumission. After 1800, however, southern states passed laws to discourage further manumissions. Southern whites feared that freed blacks would seek revenge for past treatment as slaves. However, by 1810, about 20,000 southern slaves had been freed, including 300 liberated by George Washington. Revolutionary ideas spread. Perhaps the greatest effect of the Revolution was to spread the idea of liberty, both at home and abroad. The statement that all men are created equal was radical when Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence. Although Jefferson probably intended his statement to apply to white men, African Americans and women repeated those words to claim their rights. Over the next 3 centuries, the Patriots' principles inspired revolutions around the world, beginning with the French Revolution in 1789. European Republicans cited the American precedent to overthrow kings and aristocrats. In the 19th century, independent republics emerged throughout Latin America. During the 20th century, Africans and Asians began national liberation movements. As Thomas Paine had predicted, the American Revolution changed the world. Okay guys, that's going to be it for this video. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon.